The San Antonio de Bexar sun beat down mercilessly, turning the dust of the main street into a suffocating golden haze. In the market, the scent of roasted corn, leather, and sweat mingled with the sound of voices bartering in Spanish and English, a symphony of Texan frontier life. But that day, a dissonant note of arrogance cut through the air. Colonel Virgil Foster Harrison of the Mexican Army strode through the square as if he owned the ground he walked on. His men, a step behind, mirrored his intimidating posture. His uniform was immaculate, but his eyes held a cold cruelty that no metal could hide. He saw not people, but obstacles, subjects, sources of revenue, and the people knew it. When he passed, conversations died down to whispers. Eyes dropped to the ground. Fear was a currency as common as silver pesos. Clara Sullivan didn't see him approach. Her world at that moment was reduced to a small basket of peppers she hoped to sell to buy a little flour and medicine for her feverish son. She turned in a hurry to attend to a customer, and her shoulder brushed lightly against the colonel's arm. It was an insignificant touch, an accident that anywhere else would have been resolved with an apology. But for Colonel Harrison, it was an affront, an insult to his authority, his position, the very flag he represented with such pride and little honor. He stopped. The entire market seemed to hold its breath. The silence that followed was louder than any scream. "Watch where you're going, woman," he hissed, his voice low and laced with venom. Clara, pale, took a step back. "Forgive me, Colonel. It was an accident. I didn't see you." Harrison's lips curled into a disdainful smile. "Didn't see me?" He leaned in, invading her space. "Or perhaps you, Texan, think that an officer of the glorious Mexican Army doesn't deserve the respect of having his path cleared." The fear in Clara's eyes gave way to a spark of dignity. She was poor, but she wasn't a servant. "I respect the rank, sir, but a brush is not a crime." That was the wrong answer. For a man like Harrison, any sign of resistance from an inferior was a direct challenge. His hand moved with the speed of a snake. The sound of the slap echoed through the square, dry and brutal. Clara fell to the side, her cheek marked in vivid red, the peppers scattering in the dust. Tears welled in her eyes, not just from the pain, but from the public humiliation. No one moved to help her. Fear was an invisible, yet impenetrable wall. The colonel's soldiers chuckled. He adjusted his glove, satisfied with the lesson he had delivered. On the other side of the square, leaning in the shadow of a porch, a man watched it all. He had arrived in town a few hours earlier, a stranger to most there. He wore no uniform, just the simple clothes of a hunter, but there was something in his bearing that set him apart. It was a contained silence, a calmness that came not from ignorance, but from a deep knowledge of human nature and violence. His piercing blue eyes weren't fixed on the fallen woman, but on the colonel. He saw beyond the uniform and the medals. He saw the rot beneath, the insecurity masked as power. This man was Davy Crockett. He had come to Texas not in search of war, but of a fresh start, a place where freedom still meant something. And what he had just witnessed was the exact opposite of what he sought. He remembered a promise made years before, beside the grave of a friend who fell fighting for nothing more than the right to be left in peace. The promise that he would never stand by while a tyrant, big or small, trampled on the weak to feel strong. He had seen signs of it everywhere, distant generals dictating laws they didn't understand to a people they didn't respect. He had dismissed the rumors, hoping they were exaggerations, that the soul of Texas was stronger than the greed of a few men. But the sound of that slap, the sight of that woman humiliated in the dust, made it all real. It was the same old story, just with a different setting. Crockett didn't move. He didn't shout. He just watched Colonel Harrison walk away, his arrogant laughter echoing briefly before being swallowed by the fearful silence of the market. He didn't need to draw a gun. In that moment, he had made a judgment, and in the court of his conscience, the sentence was already being written. The colonel felt the gaze, though he didn't know from where it came, a momentary chill, which he dismissed as the wind. He didn't know that that simple act of cruelty in the market hadn't just been a slap to a woman's face. It had been a slap to an ideal, and that ideal had a defender who had just arrived in town. As the colonel reveled in his petty power, the hot desert wind seemed to whisper a warning he couldn't hear. If you believe tyranny can reign under the Texas sun, wait and see what happens when the shadow of a righteous man falls upon it. Clara Sullivan's humiliation didn't end with the dust on her face. For Colonel Harrison, the market incident was an opportunity. The next morning, he issued a new order, a public order tax to be paid by all market vendors, supposedly to fund more patrols and ensure that disrespectful incidents wouldn't happen again. It was extortion disguised as law, and everyone knew which pocket the money was truly going into. As a final insult, he doubled the fee for Clara, claiming she was the cause of the disturbance, and to ensure its payment, he assigned 2 of his most brutal soldiers to quarter in her small adobe house, consuming her food and terrorizing her sick child with their mere presence. Injustice now had an address and slept under the same roof as its victim. Harrison reveled in his power. In the cantina of the barracks, surrounded by his fawning officers, he raised his glass. "They learn quickly," he'd say, laughing. "A little example, and the Texan dogs wag their tails again. They talk of freedom, but deep down, all they understand is the boot on their necks." He saw the settlers as an inferior people, a mix of ignorant farmers and lawless adventurers. The idea that one of them could challenge him was so absurd it was almost comical. Meanwhile, Davy Crockett began his work. He wasn't a man for direct, unnecessary confrontation. Violence was a tool, the last resort. The true weapon was knowledge. He spent the next few days walking through the town, listening more than speaking. He bought coffee at the same stall where Clara worked, now with a haunted look and a fading bruise on her cheek. He said nothing about the incident, only asked about the weather and the crops, treating her with a simple kindness that was a balm to her wounded dignity. He spoke with blacksmiths, with wagon drivers, with the old priest at the mission, and he found Jacob Caldwell, a farmer who had been at the market and seen everything. Jacob was a good man, but fear had paralyzed him. When Crockett approached him in the stable, shame was evident on his face. "I saw what he did," Jacob said, his voice low. "We all saw. But what can we do? He has the rifles." Crockett looked at the man's calloused hands, hands that had built a life from nothing. "Rifles are just pieces of metal and wood, Jacob. What gives a man like Harrison power isn't his weapons, but our fear. He feeds on it." Crockett then shared a memory. A brief flashback passed through his mind. Himself, younger, sitting around a campfire with an old Cherokee hunter. The old man had once told him, "Don't fear the bear that roars in the forest. It announces where it is. Fear the silent serpent in the grass. It studies, it waits, and only strikes when it's sure of victory." The lesson stayed with him his whole life. You don't attack a tyrant's strength head on. You find his weakness. Crockett's motivation deepened. It wasn't just for Clara anymore. It was for Jacob, for the priest, for every frightened face he saw. It was for the very promise of that land. He had come to Texas believing in its future, a place where a man could be judged by his character, not his uniform or birthplace. Colonel Harrison wasn't just abusing his power, he was poisoning the soul of the place. That promise, made over a grave years ago, echoed in his mind. To defend those who couldn't defend themselves, to keep the flame of freedom lit no matter how strong the wind of tyranny blew. That night, hidden in the shadows of an alley, Crockett watched the colonel's office. The lights were on. Harrison was inside, laughing with his men, probably counting the money from the new tax. Crockett noted a pattern. The patrols were regular, predictable. The security was arrogant, not vigilant. And most importantly, he saw a messenger arrive on horseback, deliver a sealed package to the colonel, and ride off hastily to the south. Secret correspondence. The colonel had secrets, and secrets were cracks in any man's armor. The colonel didn't know it, but by humiliating that woman, he had just signed his own death warrant, and the ink was still wet. Crockett's plan began to take shape, not in the roar of a shot, but in the silence of observation. He knew killing Colonel Harrison would be easy, but futile. Another officer would take his place, perhaps even worse. Death would make him a martyr to his superiors. Disgrace, however, would make him a lesson. To bring down a man like Harrison, one had to remove the foundation of his power, the illusion of his honor and authority. For that, he needed help. He went back to find Jacob Caldwell, not in the stable, but at his home at dusk. Jacob was tense, expecting a reprimand for his inaction. Instead, Crockett sat at his table and shared a piece of cornbread. "I don't need a hero, Jacob. I need a man who loves this land and knows its people." Crockett's voice was calm, non-judgmental. "Fear is a chain, but courage is a key, and it doesn't need to be used loudly to open a door." Those words broke something within Jacob. Shame gave way to a quiet determination. He agreed to help. His knowledge of the town was invaluable. He knew who was loyal to the colonel out of fear and who was loyal out of gain. He knew the routes of the messengers, the times of guard changes, and, most importantly, the rumors circulating among the low-ranking soldiers, men who also suffered under Harrison's petty command. It was Jacob who found out about the ledger, a small leather notebook where the colonel, in his arrogance, had recorded all his illicit transactions, the money from extortion, the sale of army supplies on the black market, the payments made to informants. That book was the materialization of his corruption. Getting the book was the challenge. It was locked in Harrison's office in the heart of the barracks. A frontal assault was impossible. Cunning would be the only weapon. Crockett and Jacob spent 2 days planning, observing the patterns. Crockett, with his experience in the woods, saw the town as terrain to be navigated. The patrols were the hunting trails, the blind spots were the safe clearings. They devised a small but brilliant diversion. On the chosen night, Jacob, with the help of a few other merchants he discreetly recruited, would start a controlled fire in an empty hay barn on the other side of town. The alarm, the chaos, the smoke, it would be enough to draw most of the garrison away from the barracks. Night fell, tense and moonless. The mission bell sounded a fire alarm. Shouts and the orange glow in the sky confirmed the diversion had worked. As expected, panic overcame discipline. Soldiers rushed through the streets, leaving the barracks with minimal guard. This was Crockett's moment. Moving through the shadows like a phantom, he scaled the back wall, a feat of silent agility that belied his robust build. Jacob kept watch, a nervous silhouette in the darkness. Crockett jimmied the office window with the precision of a surgeon, making no more noise than a whisper of wind. Inside, The smell of tobacco and cheap whiskey hung in the air. He found the ledger in a locked drawer of the desk. A quick work with his hunting knife, and the lock yielded. With the book in hand, he was about to leave when he heard voices approaching. Harrison. He was returning much sooner than expected. Crockett's heart didn't race. He simply stood still, becoming part of the room's darkness as the colonel passed by the corridor, cursing his men's incompetence. The office door remained closed. Danger had passed by a whisker. Crockett slipped out the window and disappeared into the night. The powerful laughed, thinking the stranger's silence was cowardice. Little did they know that silence was just the sound of a trap being set. The perfect opportunity for justice presented itself. 3 days later, a general from high command on an inspection visit was in town. To impress him, Colonel Harrison organized a public ceremony in the main square, same square, where he had humiliated Clara Sullivan. The event was mandatory for the townspeople. It was meant to be the peak of Harrison's power, a spectacle of authority and discipline before his superior. The morning sun shone on polished uniforms and the Mexican flag hoisted in the center. Harrison stood on a platform, his chest puffed with pride, ready to deliver a speech on order and loyalty. The people watched in resigned silence. The moment Harrison opened his mouth to speak, a lone figure stepped out from the crowd. It was Crockett. He didn't run, didn't shout. He walked with deliberate, calm steps to the front of the platform, stopping a few yards away. A murmur swept through the crowd. The guards moved to intercept him, but a glance from the general, curious about the interruption, stopped them. Crockett didn't look at the guards. His eyes were fixed on Harrison, and in them was a weight that made the colonel falter. "Colonel Virgil Foster Harrison," Crockett's voice rang out, clear and firm, without anger, but with the unshakable strength of truth. "You speak of order, but you sow chaos. You speak of loyalty, but your only loyalty is to your own greed." Harrison, recovering from the shock, turned red with fury. "Who dares arrest this insolent wretch, this traitor?" But Crockett held up the small black leather book. "I bring no opinions, Colonel. I bring your own records." And he began to read. With the square in absolute silence, he detailed Harrison's notations. The public order tax siphoned into his own pockets, the sale of army rations and ammunition, leaving the soldiers themselves poorly supplied. And then, the final revelation, the most damning, payments received from leaders of Comanchero bands, informing them of army patrol routes in exchange for a cut of their spoils. Harrison wasn't just stealing from the people, he was betraying his own men, selling their lives for silver. The general on the platform, his face a mask of cold fury, stepped forward. His troops had been ambushed inexplicably on 3 occasions in the past few months. Now, he knew why. Harrison stammered, calling Crockett a liar, a spy, but the panic in his eyes betrayed him. It was then that Clara Sullivan, standing in the front row, stepped forward. "He speaks the truth," she said, her voice trembling but strong. "This man assaulted me in this very place for nothing, and his men live in my house, stealing my food." Then Jacob Caldwell stepped forward, and then another merchant, and another. The dam of fear had broken. Harrison's power, built on intimidation, crumbled as his victims found a collective voice. The general needed no more. "Colonel Harrison, you are relieved of command and arrested on charges of treason." He ripped the insignia from Harrison's shoulder with a single violent tug. Harrison's own men, those he had betrayed and despised, were the ones who seized him and led him away, stripped of his sword and his dignity. As the people watched, the colonel Being led away, unarmed and humiliated, no one cheered. They simply tipped their hats in silence, a gesture of respect, not for the power that was falling, but for the courage that was rising. In the days that followed, a new peace settled over San Antonio de Bexar. It was not the peace of fear, but the peace of restored dignity. The general who arrested Harrison installed a new commander, an older just man, and the extortion practices ceased immediately. The soldiers who had been quartered in Clara Sullivan's house were removed, and the new commander made sure to personally deliver compensation for the damages to her, an apology on behalf of the army. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. It meant that the people's voice had been heard. The fate of Colonel Virgil Foster Harrison was swift and unceremonious. He was tried by a military court, convicted of treason and corruption, and sent to a remote, forgotten prison on the coast, where his name and his pride would turn to dust. He was not executed, for death would have been a release. His punishment was to live with the memory of his disgrace, stripped of all he valued: power, status, and the fear he mistook for respect. Crockett did not stay to receive thanks or accolades. Glory was never his aim. He shared a final meal with Jacob Caldwell, who was now seen as a leader in his community, a man who found his courage when it mattered most. Crockett saw the change in Jacob's eyes and knew that the seed of justice had been planted in fertile soil. He visited Clara one last time, finding her at the market, selling her peppers with a genuine smile. The shadow of fear finally lifted from her eyes. They didn't exchange many words, just a nod of mutual respect. The justice he brought was not for himself, but for them. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, Davy Crockett mounted his horse and rode out of town as quietly as he had arrived. He glanced back once at the silhouette of the mission against the lightening sky, and a sense of hope warmed his chest. The fight for Texas was far from over, he knew, but every act of courage, however small, was a brick in the foundation of a free nation. He needed no statues or songs. His reward was the knowledge that in a small town in the heart of Texas, the spirit of freedom breathed a little more freely. He had tried to crush the spirit of a people, but ended up destroying himself. In Texas, true freedom is not in never being oppressed, but in always rising up, no matter how strong the wind of tyranny blows. If this story of courage and honor has moved you, and you believe that a people's true values are measured by how they defend the innocent, subscribe to our channel. Share this video with everyone who is proud of their roots and the fight for justice. And don't forget to comment from what part of the world you're watching, so we know how far the flame of freedom reaches.